"She'll probably need help paying for the funeral," my daughter-in-law whispered, just loud enough for the people behind her to hear. And I remember thinking how strange it was that grief could feel so quiet on the outside while something inside you turned cold and sharp all at once. I stood there in the front row of the chapel, dressed in the black wool coat Robert had always said made me look dignified, my gloved hands folded neatly in front of me, and I didn't correct her, I didn't turn around, I didn't even blink, because in that moment I understood something they clearly didn't. They had already decided who I was, and it wasn't worth arguing with people who had mistaken silence for weakness. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of place where people lower their voices out of respect, but Ashley had never been particularly good at reading rooms, or maybe she just didn't care, because a few seconds later I heard her again, softer this time, "We'll take care of everything from here," and I could almost picture the small, sympathetic nods she was getting, the kind reserved for a young woman burdened with responsibility, not for the widow standing 10 feet away listening to her own life being reassigned like a set of outdated furniture. My son Daniel stood beside her, straight-backed in his charcoal suit, his expression composed, almost rehearsed, and when the pastor mentioned my husband's name, Daniel stepped forward instinctively, as if the role had already passed to him, as if the past 43 years of my marriage had quietly dissolved into a footnote no one needed to read aloud. I watched him from the corner of my eye, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of detached curiosity, because I was beginning to see how easily a narrative could be rewritten when the right person spoke with enough confidence, and Ashley had always been very good at that, at speaking just a little louder than necessary, just a little more certain than everyone else, until her version of events became the only one left in the room. The service moved on, words about legacy and memory drifting through the air like something weightless, and I felt none of the urgency people expect from grief, no sudden collapse, no trembling hands, only a quiet awareness settling deeper into my chest that this wasn't just about loss, it was about positioning, about who would be seen and who would be quietly stepped around, and I had already been placed somewhere behind the main story. When the casket was closed, Ashley reached for Daniel's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze, the kind of gesture that looks supportive from the outside but also establishes ownership, and I noticed how quickly people turned to them, offering condolences, asking practical questions, as if I were no longer the center of anything, as if widowhood came with an expiration date measured in minutes rather than years. Someone approached Ashley and asked about the arrangements, about the house, about what would happen next, and she answered with that same calm authority, "We're handling it, she doesn't need to worry about anything," and again there was that subtle shift in the room, that quiet agreement that I was something to be managed, not consulted, and I felt the faintest hint of a smile touch my lips before I could stop it, not because any of this was amusing, but because it was so incredibly predictable. They thought they understood the situation, thought they were stepping into roles that had been waiting for them, thought they were inheriting control simply because they had spoken first, and I let them believe it. I let every assumption settle exactly where they placed it, because correcting them now would have been too easy, too obvious, and I had no interest in winning a conversation when I could let them build an entire illusion on their own. I kept my gaze forward, my posture steady, my voice absent, and when the final prayer was said and people began to file out, I remained exactly where I was for a moment longer, watching as Ashley guided Daniel toward the door, already speaking about next steps, already acting as though decisions had been made, and I thought, not with bitterness but with absolute clarity, that they had just made their first and most important mistake, because I hadn't said a word about the $28 million Robert had quietly placed in my name, and I wasn't going to, not yet. The house felt unfamiliar when I walked back in that afternoon, not because anything had changed physically but because the silence had a different weight to it, like the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next, and for the first time since Robert passed, I did not sit down or remove my coat right away. I simply stood in the entryway and listened to the quiet, letting it settle around me until it stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like space that no one else was filling with their voices or their assumptions. Ashley and Daniel had already left for the reception, of course. They had insisted on hosting it at a restaurant downtown, somewhere modern and bright, somewhere that did not carry any trace of the life Robert and I had built together. And they had not asked me whether I wanted to attend, they had simply informed me of the time, the address, the expectation, and I had nodded politely, knowing full well that I would arrive exactly when I intended to, not when they thought I should. I walked slowly into the living room, my heels soft against the hardwood floor, and my eyes moved over the familiar details, the framed photographs, the antique clock Robert had insisted on restoring himself, the leather chair that still held the faint impression of his presence, and for a moment I allowed myself to remember the version of this house that existed before today, before people started speaking about me as though I were no longer part of it. There had been mornings where Robert would stand in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out the window as if he were calculating something only he understood, and when I asked him what he was thinking about, he would just smile and say, "I am making sure everything is exactly where it should be," and I used to think he meant the garden, the accounts, the small details that make a life run smoothly, but now I understood there had been something else beneath that, something quieter and far more deliberate. I moved toward his study, the one room Ashley had never liked, the one she called outdated, and I paused at the doorway, noticing that nothing had been touched, not yet, because she would not dare to make changes without first making sure she had the authority to do so, and that realization alone told me how much she believed she was about to gain. I stepped inside and ran my fingers lightly across the edge of his desk, remembering the way he used to organize everything with a precision that bordered on obsession, every document in its place, every account accounted for, and I felt that same small, controlled smile return as I considered how much of that order still existed, unseen, untouched by the assumptions being made outside these walls. My phone buzzed quietly in my bag, and when I glanced at the screen I saw Ashley's name, followed by a short message that read, "We are all waiting for you," and I let it sit there unanswered for a few seconds, not out of spite but because I was no longer responding to urgency that did not belong to me. When I finally picked up the phone, I typed back a simple reply, "I will be there shortly," and I could almost imagine the subtle irritation behind her composed expression, the slight tightening of her jaw as she recalculated her timeline, her control slipping by just a fraction. I placed the phone back into my bag and turned toward the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the yard Robert had cared for so carefully, and for the first time since the service, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me, not grief, not anger, but clarity, the kind that does not demand immediate action but instead encourages patience, because I knew now that everything they believed about me was built on an assumption they had not bothered to verify, and there is a certain kind of power in allowing people to continue under a misunderstanding they created themselves. By the time I left the house and stepped into the car, I was no longer the woman they had quietly categorized at the chapel, no longer the figure they thought needed to be managed or guided. I was simply waiting, and as I drove toward the restaurant, I found myself thinking that they would continue to speak, to plan, to position themselves exactly as they had been all day, unaware that every word was bringing them closer to a moment they were not prepared for, and I did not feel the need to rush that moment, because the longer they believed they were in control, the more complete the realization would be when they understood they never were. The restaurant was already full when I arrived, the kind of polished place with soft lighting and carefully arranged tables that made everything feel controlled and intentional, and as soon as I stepped inside I could see them across the room, Daniel standing near the center with a glass in his hand, Ashley slightly ahead of him greeting guests as if she had been preparing for this moment long before today, and for a brief second I remained near the entrance, unnoticed, watching the way the room seemed to orbit around them, how easily they had stepped into roles that did not belong to them. No one came to greet me right away, which might have felt uncomfortable once, but now it simply confirmed what I had already understood, that I had been quietly moved to the edge of the story, and I allowed that distance to remain as I made my way toward the table they had chosen, a long arrangement near the back where the lighting was just dim enough to soften details, and I noticed that my place setting had been positioned at the far end, not hidden, not removed, just placed carefully out of focus. Ashley noticed me then and approached with that same composed expression, her voice warm but measured. "Margaret, I was beginning to wonder if you would come," and I smiled politely, removing my gloves with slow, deliberate movements. "I said I would be here, and I meant it," and for a fraction of a second I saw that flicker again, the one she could not quite conceal, because control depends on predictability, and I was no longer moving in ways she could easily anticipate. Daniel joined us moments later, his tone softer, almost rehearsed. We were about to start, and I nodded as if the timing had always been aligned, taking my seat without asking for permission, and the conversation resumed around me. Stories about Robert, about his work, about the life he had built, but there was a subtle shift in the way those stories were told, as if they were being reframed to fit a version of events that no longer included me at the center. At one point a man I barely recognized leaned toward Ashley and asked quietly about the estate, about whether everything had been settled, and she answered with calm certainty, "We are working through it. It is more complicated than it looks, but we will make sure everything is handled properly," and the way she emphasized "we" was almost imperceptible, but not to me, because I understood exactly what she was doing. She was not just speaking, she was establishing ownership, creating the impression that decisions were already in motion and that I was simply part of the responsibility she had taken on. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip, not interrupting, not correcting, because every assumption she made was another step forward into a space she did not actually control. And there is a certain kind of advantage in allowing someone to move confidently in the wrong direction. Emily sat across from me, quieter than usual, her eyes shifting between Ashley and Daniel, and when our gazes met she offered a small, uncertain smile, as if she sensed something beneath the surface that she could not quite name, and I returned that smile gently, because she was not part of this, she was simply witnessing it unfold. As the evening continued, Daniel stood to speak, thanking everyone for coming, outlining what he called the next steps, using phrases that sounded responsible and measured, talking about organizing assets, maintaining stability, ensuring that everything Robert built would continue smoothly, and I listened without reaction, because what he described was not entirely wrong, it was simply incomplete, missing the one detail that would change everything. When he finished, there was a brief moment of silence, the kind that usually invites agreement, and Ashley stepped in smoothly, placing a hand on his arm, reinforcing the image they were presenting together. And in that moment I realized how thoroughly they believed in this version of events, how certain they were that the future was already theirs to shape, and I felt that same calm settle deeper inside me, not resistance, not urgency, just the quiet knowledge that they were building something on a foundation they had never examined. I placed my hands lightly on the table, looked at Daniel, then at Ashley, and allowed a small, composed smile to rest on my face, because there was nothing to correct yet, nothing to interrupt, only a growing understanding that the more they spoke, the clearer the contrast would be when the truth finally surfaced, and as the conversation carried on around me, I remained exactly where I was, present but silent, letting them continue without realizing that every word was bringing them closer to a moment that would not unfold the way they expected. The room shifted almost imperceptibly as the evening settled into something less formal, conversations breaking into smaller circles, glasses being refilled, chairs turning slightly toward those who seemed to matter most, and I noticed how naturally Ashley positioned herself at the center of each exchange, her voice soft but confident, her presence steady in a way that invited people to look to her for answers rather than to question whether she should be giving them at all. Someone near the middle of the table, a woman I recognized from one of Robert's business events years ago, leaned forward and asked with polite curiosity, "So what happens with the house now?" And it was such a simple question, the kind that could have been answered in a sentence, but Ashley did not hesitate, she smiled gently, the kind of smile that suggests both sympathy and authority, and said, "We are evaluating everything carefully, it is a large property, and maintenance alone is a lot for one person, so we are considering what is most practical moving forward," and I could feel the subtle shift again, the quiet agreement forming around her words, the assumption that she was speaking from a place of knowledge rather than convenience. I set my glass down slowly, listening to the way practicality was being used as a substitute for permission, and I let my eyes rest briefly on Daniel, who nodded in agreement as though the decision had already been made somewhere between the service and this moment, and it struck me how easily a person could convince themselves that something was necessary simply because it sounded reasonable when said out loud. Another voice joined in, a man across the table asking whether the assets would be consolidated, whether there would be changes to how things were managed, and Ashley answered again, seamlessly, as though she had rehearsed it, "We want to simplify things, reduce complications, make sure everything is under clear direction," and she placed a light hand on Daniel's arm as she spoke, reinforcing the image of unity, of leadership, of control, and I realized then that this was not casual conversation. This was positioning, each sentence building a narrative that placed her and Daniel at the center of every future decision. I felt Emily's gaze on me again, quieter now, more searching, and when I glanced up she looked away quickly, as if unsure whether she was allowed to question what she was seeing, and I understood that hesitation, because it takes time to recognize when something is being taken rather than given, especially when it is done with a smile. The waiter moved through the room, collecting empty plates, replacing them with coffee and dessert, and for a moment the conversation paused, creating a small pocket of silence, and Ashley filled it immediately, turning slightly toward me, her tone gentle, almost careful. "Margaret, we have been thinking about what would be best for you. The house is quite large, and after everything, it might be easier if you considered something more manageable, perhaps a smaller place closer to town. Somewhere with less upkeep," and the way she said it, the softness, the concern, it was almost convincing, almost something that could be mistaken for kindness if you were not paying attention to what was being suggested beneath it. I looked at her for a moment, not with surprise, not with offense, just with a quiet stillness that made her pause, and I nodded once, slowly, as if considering the idea. "That might be something to think about," I said, my voice even, and I saw the relief flicker across her face, the brief confirmation that she had moved one step further into the position she believed was hers. Daniel leaned in then, his tone practical, supportive. "We just want to make sure everything is taken care of, that you do not have to worry about anything," and there it was again, that careful phrasing, the implication that worry belonged to me while decisions belonged to them, and I let that settle without resistance, because correcting it now would have been premature, like interrupting a story before it revealed its ending. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, and I allowed the conversation to continue around me, each assumption stacking neatly on top of the last, each plan forming without foundation. And I realized that they were no longer testing the idea, they were already living inside it, already imagining a future where everything had been simplified, transferred, reorganized in ways that made sense only if one critical detail remained unspoken. I felt no urgency to break that illusion, no need to reclaim the center of the conversation, because the more complete their certainty became, the more absolute the shift would be when it finally unraveled, and as Ashley began outlining possibilities, timelines, steps that sounded increasingly concrete, I simply listened, letting her finish every thought, letting Daniel agree, letting the room accept it as fact, and I thought, not with bitterness but with quiet clarity, that they were not just planning my future, they were revealing exactly how far they were willing to go, and that knowledge was far more valuable than anything I could have said in that moment. The conversation drifted into lighter tones after that, people laughing softly, forks tapping against plates, the kind of ordinary sounds that make a moment feel harmless on the surface, but I found myself no longer following the words around me. Instead I was watching patterns, the way Ashley leaned in just before someone asked a question, the way Daniel waited for her glance before answering, the quiet choreography of control that had not appeared overnight but had grown slowly over time, unnoticed until it was already complete. I thought back to evenings in this same circle years ago, when Robert would sit at the head of the table, his presence calm but unmistakable, not loud, not forceful, but steady in a way that required no explanation, and I remembered how Ashley used to watch him then, not with affection, but with a kind of careful attention, as if she were studying something she intended to understand later, and at the time I had dismissed it as admiration, the natural response of someone new to a family with established rhythms, but now that memory shifted into something else, something far more deliberate. There had been small moments, things that felt too minor to question on their own, the way she would ask about account structures under the guise of curiosity, or how she would suggest updates to processes that had worked perfectly well for decades, always framed as improvements, always presented as helpful, and Robert would listen, nodding slightly, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not, but always watching her with that same quiet awareness he carried into everything. One evening stands out now more clearly than the others, a late fall night when the air had turned sharp and the house felt warmer because of it, and Ashley had brought up the topic of long-term planning, asking what would happen in the future, how things would be managed, what safeguards were in place, and I remember how Robert had set his glass down carefully before answering, his tone light but precise. Everything is already exactly where it needs to be, and there had been a brief pause after that, just long enough to suggest there was more behind the statement than he chose to say out loud. I had not pressed him then, because trust does not require constant explanation, and in all the years we were together, he had never given me a reason to doubt that whatever he did was done with intention, not impulse. But sitting there now, listening to Ashley outline what she believed were the next logical steps, I began to understand the full weight of what he had meant. He had seen this coming, not the specific words, not the exact timing, but the pattern, the way certain people move toward control as if it is something they are entitled to rather than something they must earn, and he had prepared accordingly, quietly, thoroughly, without announcement, because the most effective protections are the ones no one thinks to question until it is too late. I rested my hand lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present while those memories aligned into something clear and complete, and I realized that nothing happening around me was unexpected, not to him, and now, not to me. Ashley's voice continued, outlining possibilities with increasing confidence, speaking about timelines, about transitions, about what would make the most sense for everyone involved, and each sentence carried the same underlying assumption that she was already operating within a structure that supported her authority, and I allowed her to continue, because interrupting would have only slowed her down, and I had no interest in slowing anything, not when every word was bringing her closer to a conclusion she had already accepted as inevitable. Daniel added his agreement again, his voice steady, his posture aligned with hers, and I watched him for a moment, not with resentment, but with a quiet understanding that belief can be shaped gradually, that people do not always realize when they have begun to follow someone else's direction instead of their own, and I did not blame him for that, not yet, because clarity often arrives only after illusion has had time to fully reveal itself. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my expression unchanged, my silence intact, and I let the conversation move forward without me, knowing that everything they were building depended entirely on something they had never thought to verify. And as that realization settled more firmly in my mind, I felt the same calm certainty return, not as a reaction, but as a foundation, because I understood now that Robert had not only prepared for this moment, he had ensured that when it arrived, I would be the only one in the room who actually knew where everything stood. The moment came quietly, not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but in the kind of low conversation people assume no one is truly listening to, and I found myself standing near the edge of the room while the others shifted toward the bar, their laughter soft and distracted, when I heard Ashley's voice again, this time stripped of its careful warmth, speaking in a tone that was meant only for Daniel but carried just far enough to reach me. "We should not wait too long," she said, her words measured, practical, the way she always framed things when she believed she was being efficient. "The market is strong right now, and the longer we delay, the more complicated it will become." Daniel hesitated. I could hear it in the slight pause before he responded, but she filled that space immediately, continuing without interruption. "If we position it correctly, we can transition everything smoothly, sell the house, restructure the assets, and move forward without unnecessary complications." And there it was again, that word complications, used as if it were a neutral observation rather than a way to dismiss anything that did not align with her plan. I remained still, my hands resting lightly against the back of a chair, my expression unchanged, because what mattered was not the fact that she was speaking this way, it was how far she had already moved in her mind, how completely she believed that the decisions she was outlining were already within her control. Daniel lowered his voice, softer now, uncertain. "Mom might not be ready for that," and for a moment I almost allowed myself to feel something in response to that, not relief, not gratitude, but recognition that some part of him still understood there was a boundary he had not yet crossed, but Ashley did not allow that hesitation to settle. She stepped closer to him, her tone gentle again, persuasive. "Daniel," she said, "this is not about readiness, it is about what is best. She cannot manage something like that on her own, and if we do not step in now, things could become unstable." And the way she said unstable made it sound like a risk that required immediate correction, as though I were not a person but a variable that needed to be controlled before it disrupted the outcome she had already decided on. I looked down briefly, not out of submission, but to steady the small, precise shift happening inside me, the final piece aligning with everything I had observed since the service, because this was no longer assumption, no longer subtle positioning. This was intent, clear and structured, and once intent is revealed, there is no need to question it further. Emily appeared beside me then, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Grandma," she said, "I heard them earlier, they have already spoken to a realtor," and I turned my head slightly toward her, not surprised, not startled, just acknowledging what I had already begun to understand, and she continued, her words careful, as if she were unsure whether she should be saying them at all. "They are planning to list the house within the month. They think it will be easier if everything is done quickly." I placed my hand gently over hers, offering a small, reassuring pressure, not because I needed comfort, but because she did, because she was witnessing something she had not expected to see, and I gave her a calm, steady look that seemed to settle her more than any explanation could have. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly, and she nodded, stepping back as if she had done something important but was not entirely sure what it meant. I lifted my gaze again, returning it to the room, to Ashley and Daniel who had moved slightly apart from the others, still speaking in that same controlled rhythm, and I felt no urgency to interrupt them, no impulse to step forward and reclaim the conversation, because everything they were planning depended on a single assumption that had never been tested, and I understood now that correcting them too soon would only give them time to adjust, to recover, to reshape their approach before the truth could fully take effect. I reached for my coat, draping it lightly over my arm, not signaling departure, not drawing attention, just preparing, because the next step did not belong in this room, not in a space where they still believed they were setting the terms, and as I moved toward the exit, I allowed myself one final glance back, taking in the scene they had constructed so confidently, and I thought, with a quiet certainty that felt almost like relief, that they had already gone too far to turn back, and all that remained was to let them continue just long enough for the ground beneath them to disappear without warning. I did not go back inside after that. I walked past the glass doors of the restaurant and into the cool night air, the sound of conversation fading behind me as if it belonged to a different life entirely, and for a moment I simply stood there on the sidewalk, letting the quiet settle around me again, but this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but deliberate, as though everything that had been unclear just hours ago had now arranged itself into something precise and undeniable. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with the kind of calm intention that comes when you already know exactly what needs to be done, and I scrolled to a number I had not called in years, a name Robert had once told me to remember, not because I would need it often, but because if I ever did, it would matter. The line rang only once before a steady voice answered, "Margaret," and there was no surprise in the way he said my name, only recognition, as if he had been expecting this moment in a way I had not fully understood until now. "It has been a long time," I replied, my voice even measured, "but I imagine you already know why I am calling," and there was a brief pause, not uncertainty, but acknowledgement, before he answered, "I was informed this afternoon, I am very sorry for your loss," and then, more quietly, "Everything is exactly as your husband intended." I closed my eyes for just a second, not in grief, but in confirmation, because those words carried more weight than anything that had been said inside that restaurant, and I asked the only question that mattered now, "Nothing has been altered," and his response came without hesitation, "Nothing has been altered, nothing can be altered without your authorization." I let out a slow breath, one that I had not realized I had been holding, and I said, "I will need to review everything in person," and he replied, "Of course, I will have everything prepared, we can meet tomorrow morning at 9, and as the call ended, I felt the final piece of uncertainty disappear, leaving behind something far more stable than anger or reaction. It was control, quiet and complete. I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked out across the street where the city lights reflected softly on the pavement, and I thought about the conversation I had just left behind, about Ashley's certainty, Daniel's agreement, the careful plans already forming without my consent, and I realized how easily those plans had been constructed on a foundation that did not exist. They believed they were preparing to take over something that had never been theirs, believed they were moving forward with authority that had never been granted, and I felt no need to rush back inside to correct them, Because correction is only necessary when someone is still capable of reconsidering, and I had already seen how far they had gone. I walked slowly to my car, the sound of my steps steady against the pavement, and as I reached for the door handle I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity, because I understood now that this was not a situation that required confrontation, it required timing. I started the engine and sat there for a moment before pulling away, the restaurant still visible in the rearview mirror, filled with people who believed they were shaping the future. And I thought about how tomorrow would begin very differently for me than it would for them, because while they would continue planning, assuming, positioning themselves for a transition that made perfect sense in their minds, I would be sitting across from the one person who actually knew the structure they were trying to control, reviewing documents that had been put in place long before any of this began. As I drove through the quiet streets, I felt no urgency, no impulse to accelerate what was already unfolding, because there is a certain kind of strength in allowing events to reach their natural conclusion without interference, and I understood now that everything they had said, everything they had planned, had already placed them exactly where they needed to be, not in control, but in position, and all that remained was to let them continue just a little longer before they realized that the ground beneath them had never belonged to them at all. I arrived at the office the next morning a few minutes early, not out of habit but out of intention, because I wanted the space to settle before the conversation began, and when I stepped inside I was greeted by the same quiet efficiency Robert had always respected, a place where nothing was left to assumption and everything was documented with care. Mr. Collins was already waiting, standing near the large window with a folder in his hands, and when he turned toward me there was no hesitation in his expression, only a calm acknowledgement that this meeting was not unexpected. "Margaret," he said, and I nodded in return, taking a seat across from him without unnecessary formality, because there was no need for it now. He placed the folder on the table between us and opened it slowly, not as a gesture of drama, but as a matter of process, and the first page he turned toward me was not a summary, not an overview, but a legal structure, clear and precise, outlining the trust Robert had established years ago, long before Ashley had ever learned how to ask the right questions. I let my eyes move across the document, taking in the language, the dates, the signatures, and I felt a quiet recognition settle into place, not surprise, not disbelief, but confirmation, because everything I had sensed the night before was now laid out in terms that could not be misinterpreted. "The primary beneficiary," Mr. Collins said, his voice steady, "is you, and all controlling authority remains exclusively in your name unless you choose to delegate it," and I nodded slightly, not because I needed the explanation, but because hearing it spoken aloud carried a certain finality that thought alone does not provide. He turned to the next page, outlining the financial holdings, the accounts, the properties, each one structured under the same principle, ownership without ambiguity, and when he reached the figure at the bottom, he paused briefly, not for emphasis, but for clarity. "The total value currently stands at approximately $28 million, and I did not react outwardly, because the number itself was not what mattered, it was the structure that contained it, the fact that every piece of it was positioned exactly where Robert had intended. There are additional provisions," Mr. Collins continued, turning another page, "specific clauses that restrict access, transfer, or modification by any secondary party without your direct authorization," and I understood immediately what that meant, not just in legal terms, but in practical ones, because everything Ashley had described the night before, every plan, every assumption, depended entirely on a level of access she did not have and could not obtain without my consent. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I asked the question that would define everything that followed: if someone were to attempt to initiate a sale or restructuring without my approval, what would happen? And Mr. Collins did not hesitate. The process would not proceed, any such attempt would be blocked at the authorization level, and any involved parties would be notified that they do not have the legal standing to act, and there it was, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple fact, stated without emotion because it did not require any. I allowed a moment of silence to pass, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to feel the weight of that clarity settle completely, and then I closed the folder gently, placing my hand over it for a brief second as if to acknowledge not just the documents themselves, but the intention behind them. Robert had not left anything to chance, he had not relied on goodwill or assumption, he had built a structure that required nothing from anyone except recognition of what already existed. And in that moment I understood that the control Ashley believed she was stepping into was not something she had been denied, it was something that had never been available to her in the first place. I looked up at Mr. Collins and offered a small, composed smile. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, and he returned the gesture with a slight nod, because he understood what that meant without needing further explanation. As I stood to leave, gathering my things with the same measured movements I had maintained since the service, I felt no urgency to act immediately, no impulse to confront or correct, because everything that needed to be in place already was, and the only thing left to determine was timing. And as I stepped out into the morning light, I knew that the next conversation I would have with Daniel and Ashley would not require raised voices or explanations, it would only require the truth presented at the exact moment they believed they were about to take something that had never belonged to them. I did not wait long before inviting them over, not because I was eager, but because timing only works when it feels natural to the people who believe they are still in control. And by the time Daniel called me that afternoon, his voice steady but carrying a quiet urgency, I already knew what he was going to say before he said it. "Mom, we should sit down and talk about next steps," and I agreed without hesitation. Of course, that would be best, because agreement, when given at the right moment, encourages confidence, and confidence makes people less careful. They arrived early the next evening, Ashley walking in first as she always did, her posture composed, her expression measured in that familiar way that suggested she had already thought through every possible angle of the conversation. And Daniel followed just behind her, quieter now, more observant, as if some part of him was beginning to sense that things were not unfolding exactly as expected. We sat in the living room, the same room where Robert had spent years building something that required no explanation to function, and Ashley wasted very little time before beginning. "Margaret, we have been reviewing everything," she said, her tone calm, professional, "and we believe the best course of action would be to begin preparing the property for sale within the next few weeks. The market conditions are favorable, and it would allow us to streamline everything efficiently." And I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly together, my expression unchanged, because this was exactly the moment she had been moving toward since the service, the moment where suggestion becomes decision. Daniel added quietly, "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, Mom," and I nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the effort behind their concern. "That makes sense," I said, my voice even, measured, and I saw the immediate shift in Ashley's posture, the subtle release of tension, the confirmation she had been expecting, because agreement, when given too easily, often goes unquestioned. She continued, outlining timelines, mentioning the realtor Emily had referenced, speaking in specifics now rather than possibilities, and I allowed her to finish, because people reveal the most when they believe they are no longer being evaluated. When she paused, I reached to the side table and picked up the folder I had placed there earlier, not with emphasis, not with hesitation, just as a natural continuation of the conversation, and I opened it carefully, turning the first page toward them. "Before we move forward," I said, "there is something you both need to understand," and the room shifted immediately, not dramatically, but enough, the kind of shift that happens when certainty meets something unexpected. Ashley's eyes moved to the document, scanning quickly, her confidence holding for just a moment before it began to falter, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening as he read the first lines. "This is the trust your father established," I continued, my tone calm, precise, and it outlines exactly how everything is structured, including who has the authority to make decisions regarding the property, the accounts, and any potential sale. There was a brief silence, longer than any pause that had occurred the night before, and Ashley spoke first, her voice controlled but no longer effortless. "I was not aware of this arrangement," and I met her gaze steadily. "I know," I said simply, "because if you had been, you would not have spoken so confidently about things you cannot authorize." Daniel looked up then, confusion replacing certainty. "What does this mean?" And I turned the page slightly, allowing the relevant section to rest clearly in front of him. "It means that all control remains with me," I said, and that no sale, no restructuring, no transition can occur without my direct approval. The silence that followed was complete, not filled with questions, not broken by explanation, just still, as understanding settled into a space where assumption had been, and I did not raise my voice, I did not elaborate, because there was no need to. The documents spoke with a clarity that did not require reinforcement. Ashley's expression shifted again, this time not to confidence or control, but to calculation, as if she were searching for a way to reposition herself within a structure she had not anticipated. But there was no space left for that, not now, not after everything had already been said. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, my movements as calm as they had been all along, and I looked at Daniel, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet steadiness that left no room for misunderstanding. Your father made sure everything was exactly where it needed to be, I said, and for the first time since the service, no one in the room had anything to add.